Los Angeles has a new Airbnb tenant from hell, and we're going to talk about it in this episode of the Filing Cabinet. My name is Sasha Struthers. I am an attorney in Los Angeles, and I do landlord-tenant law. So to get right into it, Elizabeth Hirshon is Harvard educated, I'm presuming Harvard grad, whose journey in being an Airbnb nightmare actually started when she was a subtenant in Oakland. So this little journey, as I've learned, started in September 2019. She sublet a room in a house up in Oakland. And shortly after moving in, she cited that the apartment wasn't clean enough and it wasn't clean to her standards and that she had severe sensitivities. She dragged this into 2020. She didn't want to pay rent. COVID hit and there was orders to stay in place in California. So when those orders came down, she used them to her advantage and wouldn't pay rent, wouldn't move out, and you couldn't evict tenants for not paying rent in most parts of California during COVID. So it took another year until July 2021, and she was able to settle with the tenant who leased the house and the owners of the house, and she moved out July 2021-ish. From there, she went to Los Angeles. So during her time in Oakland, after COVID, she didn't pay rent for a year, and ultimately she agreed to move out July 2021. So from there, she Airbnb'd for 6 months as everyone calls, a mansion in Brentwood, except she Airbnb'd the guest house. So not the main house, I'm understanding. She Airbnb'd the guest house. And she Airbnb'd it for 6 months. And then after the 6 months, she would not leave. She said that she didn't feel safe being forced to move out during COVID. Found out that the shower wasn't permitted in this guest house. The owner offered to fix some things. I guess the electric blind stopped working. The owner said he would fix it. She didn't want to leave the house, wouldn't stay in a hotel. The owner offered for her to stay in his house so he could do the repairs. She felt uncomfortable by that, which is valid. I don't think anyone ever wants to stay with their landlord. But I think it was out of an act of desperation and trying to get the woman, to agree to come out so he can repair the stuff in the Airbnb and hopefully get her to pay rent. So she has not paid since the 6-month expiration of the Airbnb, which was, I think, from August, September, October, November, December, January, February 2022. So stopped paying rent and wouldn't leave. So at some point she was like, okay, I'll move out in April. She didn't move out. She has stayed put in the guest house on this property since, and she is there to this date. Won't pay any money and has now demanded $100,000. And the reason being, she's claiming that the guest house is not habitable. I think it's lacking a C of O, certificate of occupancy, and that the shower is not permitted. She won't let the owner come in to fix things. He might be able to permit it, but she's not allowing entry. And the owner is kind of in a tough spot. And I'll explain to you the few reasons why owner's in a tough spot. To begin, Los Angeles does not like short-term rentals. They don't like short-term rental houses. They don't like short-term rentals of apartments. It's virtually banned in most areas of Los Angeles County and within the cities in Los Angeles. So Los Angeles is its own city, and there's other cities in Los Angeles. So this county, Los Angeles City itself, and the other cities within the county, they're not part of the county. If it's confusing, don't be surprised. Los Angeles County is comprised of 88 incorporated cities. So that's how big Los Angeles is. And then there's the county, which is the unincorporated part. So that being said, that was very long-winded. There's a lot of restrictions on what you can do for Airbnbs. And a lot of rent-controlled cities have their own restrictions on Airbnbs. They only let certain properties be Airbnb. They restrict how much time out of the year they can be Airbnb'd. And there's usually an Airbnb registry. So if you're going to do short-term rentals, they have a short-term rental registry. And you have to sign up for a few licenses, pay taxes, fees, etc. There's a lot of restrictions to it. I don't know if that was done or not done by the landlord, who is Sasha Struthers, who's a doctor in Los Angeles. So the Airbnb thing, very dicey. If you are thinking about going into the Airbnb business, I would not do it in any metropolitan city in Los Angeles. Even Palm Springs crack down heavily on Airbnbs, and they're virtually not affordable. Not affordable, that's not the right word. Not profitable. So they're just not a great idea in many areas of California. Other states, people tend to thrive or are able to thrive. But in California, where you think they would be amazing because there's just naturally a lot of tourism, major cities don't like them. So that's already a boon to the landlord. The second thing is Brentwood is part of Los Angeles City. And back in March of this year, 2023, LA City passed a new ordinance and expanded its rent control powers, limited amount of those powers, but nonetheless expanded the rent control powers to all residential rentals in Los Angeles. And so there's restrictions on what landlords, how landlords can get units back under traditional RSO, which is, 2 or more units built in 1978 or older. Those are the traditional rent-controlled units. But now anything, even houses that are being leased in the city, there's restrictions on evicting tenants in those. And LA City has that for houses. Even though they're not traditionally rent-controlled, there's still eviction restrictions on them. That ordinance itself is being challenged, and the city is being sued over it, claiming that it violates multiple state laws. But until that's been determined, it's in effect. But you may be asking, well, they're not a tenant, they're an Airbnb guest. That is where it becomes a little bit of a gray area, and where the judge is probably going to decide more in favor of the tenant. Is if the Airbnb is not permissible, then they are a tenant. And at some point, the woman did pay. It appears she paid the first 6 months. So once someone is in a property, once someone has moved in, even if it's the guest short term, after 30 days, you're pretty sunk. They're like, they convert to a tenant. So even if you don't think they're a tenant, or there wasn't a tenant relationship from the outset, it was a license, which is what Airbnb guests have, she's blown through that. So the city is going to decide that the woman's a tenant, even though the agreement was that she was supposed to be just a guest staying temporarily. Knowing the courts, I don't see that they're gonna be like, okay, she's a guest. That's it. She's staying in the house. She's paying to stay in the house. Tenant. And then she's going to claim I don't have to pay rent because the house didn't have a C of O, this, being this guest house, and the shower was unpermitted, so it's not inhabitable. So you get past that issue, like, okay. She's overstayed, I think somewhere said 540 days, and she hasn't paid rent. So we're far past a year, about a year and a half, and she hasn't paid rent. Which is like every landlord's nightmare, that someone is staying in a property, not paying rent. The utilities are going to be in the landlord's name. So the landlord's paying the utilities for this woman living in this house and not paying rent. So that becomes another problem. Where this eviction and this $100,000 thing becomes an issue is under the LA City ordinance, she's likely going to have to get relocation. And the city calculates relocation and has its own calculations. It says this is what relocation is. So in the event that a unit's uninhabitable and the tenant is entitled to relocation, or for other reason a tenant is entitled to relocation, the city has its own calculation for that, and it's not $100,000. Where the $100,000 comes in is that she has 15 other causes of action against the landlord. Nuisance, intentional infliction of emotional distress, violations of Business and Professions Code, probably Section 17200, which is the most common one, and violation of LA County's COVID protections. This is where, if you're in this video and you're still watching it, you'll be like, well, why don't the police take her out for squatting? And let me see if I can get back in focus. That does not happen in California. So even though she's an Airbnb guest and you're arguing that she's not a tenant, once they're in there, the cops, whether it's the sheriffs, LAPD, municipal cops, whatever it is, they're by and large trained to not take anybody out of a property until there's a sheriff lockout. Only the sheriff can lock people out. And they can only lock people out through a court order. So the police don't lock people out. The police don't take people out. Only the sheriff's department does that. And so the sheriff has to get a court order from a judge that says, on this date and this time, you can go into the unit, and whoever's in there, you can take them out, and then the owner can change the locks right there. It's called the sheriff lockout. Besides that, if you call the police, if you call the sheriff, they will not take somebody out of a property. Doesn't matter if they're squatting, if they're an overstayed Airbnb guest. It is very, very rare that the police will take them out. They will tell you to your face, this is a civil matter. And when they say it's a civil matter, it means you have to file an unlawful detainer, also called an eviction. So if people go, well, the police can come get her, the police will not come get her. Well, I would go in there and then I would get her out. That's considered self-help, and that could wind you up with a misdemeanor. So you don't want to do that. So the landlord's really stuck in what the landlord can do. And why she wants $100,000 is because she's suing for all these other things. And I don't know if she's representing herself or if she has an attorney. But part of, if she has an attorney, typically attorneys on these kinds of cases representing tenants will take it on a contingency. So then the attorney gets a percentage of the case for the work that they've done. And then they get whatever fees they advance, so court filing fees, process serving fees, they get that reimbursed to them out of the settlement amount. So that can oftentimes drive up the cost of these. Where it gets even dicier for the landlord is that this is in Los Angeles. So the court in which these cases, his case against her for the back rent and damages, and her case against him for this negligence, emotional distress, etc., those are going to be heard in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles courts tend to be very pro-tenant. Not always, but most of the judges tend to be very pro-tenant. And so the landlord's going to have an uphill battle in dealing with that. And it's likely going to err on the side of she's going to need to get paid to move. My thoughts on this from the tenant side. I understand I do and I don't, but I understand someone just knowing their, the law, knowing their rights, and, bending that to their will. I see that you could do that, which is, in this case, that's what Ms. Hershon's doing. She's bending the ambiguity of the law in her favor. And some of it's not ambiguous and some of it is. I see that can be done. Morally, I wouldn't do it. If I was her, which I could possibly be her, I could go rent a place and do this. I don't think I would. And part of the reason why I wouldn't is because I wouldn't want this done to me. So if I worked really hard and I had a house and maybe I acquired a second house and I moved into my second house and I rented out this other one, I can do that. Nothing's stopping me from doing that. And a lot of people do that. And that's something you're really proud to have the money to buy the first one. If you had the ability to buy the second one and you can use the other, the first one for income, that's great. A lot of people strive to have that kind of passive income. So being mad at a landlord, I don't get that. And the house is in Brentwood, so it's arguably the value of renting there is really high. And she was able to pay it, and that's where she wanted to be. So in that sense, I don't have any beef with the landlord having two houses and renting one. I don't see that being a problem. Her knowing the law, being informed about it, and then bending it to her favor, she could be lying. Many times it's been brought up that she had disabilities or sensitivities, and that she had to be treated a certain way, or certain things had to be done, or she couldn't move out because of this. That all can be proven later. Maybe you accept it at face value, and maybe challenge and go, I want proof of it, or you go through the process of trying to validate the tenant's disabilities in a way that's lawful. I can understand that. I think a lot of people get, once the word disability is thrown out, landlords get very apprehensive because you don't want to get in trouble of being accused of discriminating against someone based on their disability. But just because you say disability or that you're disabled, that doesn't then bestow upon you all of these rights, or that you can just simply say that trigger word and then it excuses behavior. You're staying in the property. You're claiming that there's damages to it or that things need to be done. You don't want to let the landlord in to fix it. You don't want to pay for it. You don't want to resolve it. Instead, you want to stay out as long as you can and not pay rent. And what this does is it sets the tone for everybody. She's all over the news. So now everyone knows her name, knows her face, and will likely not rent to her. And if she doesn't have the means to buy a house, she's going to have a tough time finding new housing. Even if she gets the $100,000, I don't foresee anyone, no matter how much she's willing to pay for rent, being like, yeah, go ahead, you can rent with me. Because it's all over the news. It's a Harvard-educated individual who's doing this. And whether maybe legally she's right and she's entitled to relocation, it's the way that she's gone about it. And the fact that she hasn't cooperated in the landlord's efforts to move in, or efforts to repair, that she had a 6-month Airbnb agreement that she completely blew through and then refused to leave at the end of the Airbnb agreement. So already she broke that agreement, and then said, I'm not leaving. And if you want me to leave you, I want $100,000, which is in excess of what the relocation amount would be. So could she get it? Yeah. Can she negotiate it? Sure. But I think a lot of people are going to find it really hard to be empathetic to her because, one, you could afford 6 months of Airbnb rent money to reside in Brentwood. And these laws, a lot of the rent control laws are meant to keep people in their apartments who have limited income, fixed income, or low income. That's what those laws are for, to help those people. And so people are not going to be as empathetic to like this woman who seems to have a lot of money or, can't afford this, being like, I'm just not going to pay rent and I'm going to go after the landlord and demand $100,000. Some people, there might be fans of her out there that goes, yeah, great. There's people who don't like landlords. It is what it is. But now she's up to like the public to judge her. And if she wants to go rent again, this is not going to look good to any landlord. And a lot of people see this. I mean, it's been covered in multiple news outlets, literally all over the planet. And so the last part is like, I couldn't live with myself knowing that I let something carry on this long with this much animosity. As an attorney, my job is to fight, but I also, don't like laboring things beyond what they need to be. If I can resolve something, I'll try to resolve it. Does it cost effective for me? Well, it's cost effective for my client. I might not make as much money, but my goal is really to have a resolution. And I don't like racking up fees that I don't have to rack up. So in that case, I always have a resolution-minded approach to things. I'm always trying to resolve things in a manner that, mitigates, my client's exposure, oftentimes in the side of the landlord, and in times when I represent tenants, I try to get a resolution so people can move on, because that's usually the goal of everybody, is to move on. And that's, partly the reason why I have my own law practice, so that I can make those decisions and I don't have to worry about someone worrying about billing and me billing more, than I am. But I don't have the outlook of like, I want to like scorch earth. And that's what this feels like. It feels like, yeah, maybe the law might be in her favor. But it's more so that she just wants to scorch earth. Like, she just wants to have her way. And now this has come out, and it's probably the landlord pushed to have this brought to media outlets, because that's a way possibly he can pressure her to try to resolve this now that the whole world has eyes on her. Like, why are you doing this? And she's going to get probably a lot of negative blowback. And if you believe in karma, that's for you to decide which way karma would go on this. But the landlord, it appears, tried to cooperate, offered to give her hotel stays, offered to pay her money, try to resolve this with her. And for over a year and a half, she simply said, I'm not leaving and I'm not paying you, and I want $100,000. And that's where it becomes really tricky. Arguably, the relocation she might be entitled to. They're arguing that she wants her back rent. I'm not sure she's going to get the back rent, because there's still a contract and she's still getting the benefit of living there. So it's not like the thing was completely destroyed in a fire. She's been living there. It's good enough for her to live there for a year and a half. So to say like this thing is uninhabitable and I shouldn't have to pay, well, then why are you living there? Like, it's good enough for you to live in Brentwood in this guest house for like 2 years, but it's not good enough to pay for, because she's still getting a benefit of the contract. She's still getting predominantly a house that she's living in and she can shower in and go to the bathroom and sleep in. So she's living there. And that's where, it'll be interesting to see how this resolves. It's probably going to settle, and the settlement agreements aren't public record. Those are usually confidential and signed between the parties. If there's an unlawful detainer filed, in that case, they'll probably settle to have that sealed, so you don't get to see that. It's a sealed record. So you're not likely going to find out ever, if this settles, what the terms of the settlement are. But it's likely going to result in him paying her money to move out. But these are the kind of things, when you become a landlord, especially in Los Angeles, that you have to be really, really mindful. And a lot of attorneys, if you were to ask them to your face, should I invest in residential property in California or Los Angeles, they would probably tell you no. To be a landlord in Los Angeles is really hard. You have to have, first of all, very thick skin, because the relationship at its core, given all of the laws around it, you're almost adversaries as soon as the lease is signed. Not them saying that people are like that, but there's very much this sense of like, landlords are very terrified of tenants. That's why leasing is such a big deal for landlords, and why the criteria gets harder and harder, is because you want to make sure that you have a tenant who's not going to do something like this. That's like every landlord's fear. And so in Los Angeles, there's a lot of room for that. There's a lot of gray area. The tenants get a lot of leeway. And, it costs a lot of money to enforce your rights. If you have principles or rights, it's very expensive to uphold them in California. And so for that's why a lot of landlords, they either sell the residential property they have and they trade into something else, or they sell it and they move the money out of state to maybe apartments in another state. And keep in mind the instability of it's not unstable, but the difficulty of owning residential property, like let's say in Los Angeles, and all of the laws. It then has landlords moving from Los Angeles out. And so then it starts impacting those areas. So like rents start going up in other areas. And then simply because, they have this idea that, well, I can rent this here for this amount. I'll do something there. I'll fix up the units. I'll raise the prices there. So the outward projection of the money can sometimes increase rents in other states, in other localities. Another thing is when a landlord sells here, like a mom and pop landlords are typically, there's a definition for them by certain codes, but the idea in the industry, colloquially, is a mom and pop landlord is usually, like an individual or a family that owns real estate. So they might own a lot of units, they might own a couple of units, but they own it together instead of like a major property management company, like, Greystar owning and managing a bunch of properties, or other huge corporations. So mom and pops, when things squeeze them and they're not able to maintain the ongoing expenses, the increased property taxes, utilities, mortgage payments, etc., when they get squeezed or they get exhausted by animosity, they sell, and usually an investor comes in or a corporation comes in and they buy it, and they do buyouts sometimes. So I've done a lot of buyouts with tenants, and I've gotten agreements done. Tenants have vacated, or they double down on the lease agreement and on their rights, and they start evicting, and they'll just gamble with the court system. And so then that creates more, because at the end of the day, they're buying this asset, which is this apartment building, to make it churn, to make it cash flow. And it might not cash flow when they buy it, but after a year, that's their whole goal. And they're a corporation, and they have little to no feeling. And they're very desensitized to getting yelled at. They're very desensitized to tenant demands, and they're very by the book. And they have a lot of risk tolerance. Mom and pops don't have risk tolerance. They don't like to go through eviction courts. They're very expensive. They're very uncertain, and they make everybody nervous. Corporations don't have that same kind of fear. So things like this, how I see it in the long run, the more cases like this come out, people are going to start taking more and more property off the rental market. So they're just going to say, forget it. I'm like houses. They're just going to go, I'm not leasing houses. And that really sucks for a lot of families, because, families want houses. If they can't afford to buy their own house, or maybe an apartment building is just too small, they want to move into a house. And so it's going to start squeezing the number of houses, like single family residences, that are going to be available on the market to rent. And so then those are going to be taken off. And that might possibly help, the other issue with the housing, which is not enough houses that are available for sale for end users. People who are buying their own home and want to move in at close. So it's going to shift that, where people are going to either buy tenants out or get tenants out, and they're not going to rent to tenants anymore, and they're just going to sell the house, take it off market. Who knows what they're going to do with it. Then for apartments, maybe duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, they'll start taking those offline. They're just going to go, forget it. We're not going to lease it. Some people will go very far, so they just permanently take it off the market, or when there's a vacancy, they just won't fill them. And I've heard from a lot of landlords, they have hesitation in filling vacancies because they go, I'm just so afraid. I'm so afraid someone's going to come in and they're going to make all these demands, and then I'm going to get sued. I'm going to lose all this rent money, and I'm going to be anxious all the time. I'm going to be like living in a state of fear. And a lot of landlords do live in a state of fear. And people might feel like, great, like, they hate landlords. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. Hating landlords is not necessary. It's really hard to earn enough money to buy real estate. And if you were to ask most people, they wish they could own real estate. And there's many factors, like now it's incredibly hard to buy real estate because there's not a lot of inventory, and interest rates are extremely high. And when you buy a property, you have to pay the increased property taxes on it, the increased insurance premiums because insurance is going up everywhere, the increased maintenance, like all of that. So it's hard to buy this asset in the first place. And then the appreciation, which is the equity in the property, that could take 10 plus years to gain. It's not a right away thing, like you buy it and the thing like jumps up in value because you bought it. It doesn't work like that. So not every landlord is like a money bag simply because they're the landlord. And I think that's misleading. But there's a balance to be met. There's a balance to have rights for tenants, and there's a balance to have rights for landlords. And I think both need to have rights. But in this case, you see cases like this, and there's a shocking or a wow factor because, like, wow, she wants $100,000. $100,000 is a pretty typical demand in a lawsuit. Like, that number does not. I'm not shocked by that number. I've seen that number. That's common. But it's shocking to a lot of people who have not seen that number, have not experienced something like that, and it's terrifying for the landlord. And so, this likely, now that there's been so much publicity about it, I anticipate there's probably going to be a settlement agreement. She's probably going to agree to move out, and she's going to have a very, very tough time finding a new rental. So that's going to be her problem. Maybe she won't. Maybe someone will just never see this article, or these articles, or know about this. But it's probably going to be very difficult for her. And this is the kind of tone that, for tenants who engage in something like this, is that, your reputation, if you're going to be a tenant, and you want to find new housing, stuff like this you need to be mindful of. And most tenants are not going to get notoriety or publicity from something like this, but it could go on your record. You're not going to get a very good rental reference. You might get, at best, a neutral rental reference, which is, could still make it difficult to find an apartment. And landlords are increasingly more strict on who they're renting to avoid these kinds of situations. So that is my 2 cents on that. It is going to be settled. All things in life are typically settled. Almost everything settles. Everything's a negotiation. And we'll see what happens here. But I'll keep you posted, and maybe I'll do a short on updates on this if I find out anything more interesting. You can also sign up for my newsletter. Every Sunday, I send out a newsletter with information for landlords, and I also link news articles. This article was linked on my last newsletter last Sunday, so it's free. I have a lot of great information in there that will be linked below should you want to sign up for that. Otherwise, thanks for checking in, and I'll see you in the next one.